The cold wind rattled the windows of the stagecoach as it rolled into Hays City, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878. Eleanor Thompson clutched her 6-month-old daughter Sarah to her chest, trying to shield the infant from the biting chill that had settled over the prairie. The baby's small face was buried in the crook of Eleanor's neck, her tiny breaths a comforting rhythm against her skin. It had been 3 months since Thomas, Eleanor's husband, had been laid to rest. 3 months of grief, uncertainty, and a journey that had brought her to this dusty frontier town with nothing but $2 to her name, a small trunk of belongings, and the child they had created together. "End of the line, madam," the driver called, his voice gruff from years of shouting over the sound of horses and wind. "Hays City." Eleanor nodded, gathering her shawl more tightly around herself and Sarah. Her fingers, red and chapped from the cold, fumbled with the latch of the stagecoach door. She hadn't expected Kansas to be so cold in October, but the wind cut across the plains like a blade, finding every gap in her threadbare coat. "Need a hand with that trunk?" the driver asked as he climbed down from his perch. "Yes, please," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Thank you." The driver, a weathered man with a salt and pepper beard, nodded and hoisted her small trunk down from the top of the coach. "Where you headed, madam?" Eleanor pulled a crumpled letter from her pocket. "The Prairie Rose Boardinghouse. My cousin said it's the most respectable place in town for a woman alone." The driver's expression shifted slightly, but he simply nodded. "2 blocks down, left at the general store, can't miss it. Yellow house with white trim." Eleanor thanked him again and began the walk, her arms aching from holding Sarah for so long. The baby stirred and began to fuss, small whimpers that threatened to become full-blown cries. Eleanor bounced her gently, murmuring soft reassurances as she dragged the trunk behind her with her free hand. Hays City was larger than she had expected, though not nearly as large as St. Louis, where she had spent her entire life. The main street was lined with businesses: a general store, a saloon, a bank, and various other establishments that spoke of a town that had grown rapidly with the coming of the railroad. People hustled by, many giving her curious glances, some nodding politely, others looking away when they noticed the baby and the absence of a husband. The Prairie Rose Boardinghouse stood exactly where the stagecoach driver had said it would, its yellow paint faded from the harsh prairie sun and wind. Eleanor paused at the bottom of the steps, taking a deep breath before climbing them one at a time, her trunk bumping behind her. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a thin woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, as gray as her hair, narrowed as they swept over Eleanor and then focused on the baby. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone making it clear that helping was the last thing she intended to do. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Eleanor Thompson. I wrote to you about a room," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Thompson." The woman frowned. "Yes, I received your letter." "You didn't mention a child." Eleanor swallowed. "This is my daughter, Sarah. She's only 6 months old and very quiet, I assure you." Mrs. Whitmore's frown deepened. "I'm afraid that won't do, Mrs. Thompson. The Prairie Rose is a respectable establishment. We don't allow children." They disturbed the other boarders with their crying and carrying on. Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "But I have nowhere else to go. My cousin recommended your establishment specifically. Your cousin should have informed you of our policy." Mrs. Whitmore's voice was cold. "Perhaps you should try the hotel down by the railroad. They're less particular." The door began to close, but Eleanor, driven by desperation, put her foot forward to stop it. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore, I can pay extra. Sarah is a good baby. She rarely cries." "I said no, Mrs. Thompson." The woman's voice had turned to ice. "Now please remove your foot from my door before I call for the marshal." As if on cue, Sarah began to cry, her small face reddening with the effort. Eleanor tried to soothe her, but the baby could sense her mother's distress. Mrs. Whitmore's expression hardened further. "You see, already disturbing the peace. I'm afraid I must insist that you leave." The door opened wider suddenly, and Mrs. Whitmore turned with a startled expression. Behind her stood several people, boarders, Eleanor assumed, who had been drawn by the commotion. They stared at Eleanor and the crying baby with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. "What's going on here, Ida?" one woman asked, her voice tight with disapproval. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Mrs. Atkins. This woman was just leaving," Mrs. Whitmore replied. Eleanor felt hot tears prick her eyes as she realized the futility of her situation. She was about to turn away when a deep voice cut through the murmurs of the gathered boarders. "Now hold on just a minute." The crowd parted, revealing a tall man in a worn leather vest and cotton shirt. His dark blonde hair was longer than was fashionable, brushing his collar, and a short beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught Eleanor's attention, a clear, steady blue that met her gaze directly. "Seems to me, Mrs. Whitmore, that turning away a woman and her child with night coming on isn't the Christian thing to do," the man said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. Mrs. Whitmore drew herself up. "Mr. Winters, I run a respectable establishment, and respectable folks don't leave babies out in the cold," he interrupted, his tone still mild but brooking no argument. He turned to the gathered boarders. "I reckon anyone here who can't abide the occasional cry of a baby might want to reconsider what real hardship looks like." The boarders shifted uncomfortably, many looking away. The man, Mr. Winters, moved through the small crowd until he stood directly before Mrs. Whitmore. He wasn't threatening, but there was something about his presence that made the older woman take a small step back. "Bring them in," he said simply, gesturing toward Eleanor and Sarah. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The man continued to look at her, his gaze unwavering. I. Mrs. Whitmore sputtered, then collected herself. "I suppose, for one night, but the regular rates apply plus an additional fee for the child." Eleanor felt relief wash over her, followed quickly by anxiety. "How much?" she asked, already calculating if her meager funds would cover it. Before Mrs. Whitmore could name a price, the man spoke again. "The regular rate will do just fine, Ida. No extra fees." Mrs. Whitmore's face tightened, but she nodded curtly. "Very well. Room 3 at the top of the stairs. Supper is at 6 sharp." With that, she turned and walked stiffly down the hallway, the other boarders dispersing behind her. Eleanor stood awkwardly in the doorway, Sarah's cries having subsided to hiccuping whimpers. She looked up at the man who had come to her defense. "Thank you, Mr. Winters. I'm Eleanor Thompson." He touched the brim of an imaginary hat in a gesture of respect. "Reed Winters, madam, and it's no trouble at all." His eyes softened as they rested on Sarah. "Beautiful little one you have there." Eleanor felt a small, genuine smile tug at her lips for what seemed like the first time in months. "This is Sarah." Reed Winters nodded, then bent to pick up her trunk with effortless strength. "Let me help you get settled, Mrs. Thompson." Ida Whitmore's bark is worse than her bite, but best to get you and little Sarah out of the cold. As Eleanor followed Reed Winters up the narrow staircase, she felt a strange sensation, like a small flicker of warmth in the cold emptiness that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. It wasn't hope, not quite yet, but perhaps it was the possibility of hope. And for now, in this dusty frontier town, as winter approached, that would have to be enough. Reed Winters set Eleanor's trunk down in the small, sparsely furnished room that would be her new home. The space was clean but austere: a narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped pitcher and bowl, a small table with a single chair, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. The window overlooked the main street of Hayes City, the glass rattling slightly with each gust of wind. "It's not much," Reed said, seeming to read her thoughts, "but it's warm enough once the stove downstairs gets going." Eleanor nodded, gently bouncing Sarah, who had finally settled into quiet wakefulness. "It's fine, thank you. I've learned not to be particular these past few months." A shadow of something: concern, perhaps, or curiosity passed over Reed's face, but he didn't pry. Instead, he moved to the window and checked that it was properly sealed against the wind. "If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Thompson, what brings you to Hayes City?" "Not many women come here alone, especially with a young one." Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "My husband, Thomas, died of fever this past summer. We were farmers outside of St. Louis." The words were becoming easier to say with repetition, though the pain they carried hadn't lessened. "After he was gone, the bank called in our loan. I couldn't keep the farm, not alone with Sarah." Reed nodded, his expression grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam. Thank you." Eleanor looked down at Sarah, drawing strength from her daughter's wide, curious eyes. "My cousin Martha wrote that there might be opportunities here. The school needs a teacher, and I taught for 2 years before I married. It's not much, but it's something." "Miss Abernathy retired last month," Reed confirmed. "Town's been looking for someone to take her place. You should speak with Mayor Collins tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the information. A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but full of unasked questions. Finally, Reed cleared his throat. "Well, I should let you get settled. Supper's at 6, like Ida said. Might be best to come down a few minutes early. The other boarders will be curious, but they're decent folks for the most part. Thank you again, Mr. Winters, for everything. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't spoken up." A slight flush crept up Reed's neck, visible above his collar. "Couldn't let Ida turn away a lady and her child, could I? Wouldn't be right." He moved toward the door, then paused. "If you need anything, Mrs. Thompson, I'm in room 6, end of the hall." After he left, Eleanor sat for a long moment, trying to gather her thoughts. The journey had been long and difficult, and the near rejection by Mrs. Whitmore had been the final blow to her already fragile spirits. But the unexpected kindness of a stranger, this quiet cowboy with steady blue eyes, had given her a reprieve, a moment to breathe. She laid Sarah on the bed, surrounding her with pillows to prevent her from rolling, and began to unpack her meager belongings. From the trunk, she removed a small framed photograph of Thomas, taken just weeks before his illness. His smile, frozen in time, made her heart ache with a familiar pain. "We made it to Kansas, Thomas," she whispered to the photograph. "It's not what we planned, but we're here." Sarah cooed and kicked her legs, drawing Eleanor's attention back to the present. She smiled at her daughter, tracing a gentle finger along her plump cheek. Sarah was the image of her father, with the same dark hair and expressive brown eyes. Sometimes it hurt to look at her, to see Thomas reflected in their child's face, but it was also a comfort, a living reminder of the love they had shared. Eleanor finished unpacking quickly. She had brought only necessities, having sold most of their possessions to pay for the journey. She washed her face in the basin, changed Sarah's diaper, and tried to make herself presentable for supper. Her black morning dress was travel-stained and wrinkled, but it was the best she could do. At 10 minutes to 6, Eleanor made her way downstairs, Sarah cradled in her arms. The boarding house was quiet, save for the muffled sounds of Mrs. Whitmore in the kitchen, and the occasional creak of the structure as it settled. Eleanor followed the scent of cooking food down the hallway to a dining room where a long table had been set for the evening meal. Mrs. Whitmore emerged from the kitchen, carrying a large pot that steamed in the cool air of the dining room. She paused when she saw Eleanor, her expression still disapproving but somewhat resigned. "You're early," she said flatly. "I thought I might help with anything that needs doing," Eleanor offered. Mrs. Whitmore considered this for a moment, then nodded grudgingly. "You can put the bread on the table. It's in the kitchen. Mind the baby doesn't touch anything." Eleanor followed her into the kitchen, a warm space dominated by a large cast iron stove. On the counter sat a basket covered with a cloth. Balancing Sarah carefully, Eleanor managed to take the basket and carry it to the dining room, where she arranged the sliced bread on a platter at the center of the table. Gradually, the other boarders began to filter in. A middle-aged couple introduced themselves as the Richardsons. He worked at the bank. She helped at the millinery shop. An older gentleman with spectacles was Mr. Hoffman, the town's pharmacist. 2 young men in their 20s were clerks at the general store. And finally, Raid Winters appeared, having changed into a clean shirt for supper. He took a seat directly across from Eleanor, offering her a reassuring nod as Mrs. Whitmore called everyone to attention. "Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our newest boarder, Mrs. Thompson, and her child." Mrs. Whitmore's hesitation made it clear that she still wasn't pleased about Sarah's presence. "Mrs. Thompson is a widow from St. Louis, here to inquire about the teaching position." The boarders murmured greetings, some more welcoming than others. Mrs. Richardson leaned forward with a smile. "A teacher, how wonderful! The children have been running wild since Miss Abernathy left." "You have experience with Western children, Mrs. Thompson?" Mr. Richardson asked, his tone slightly condescending. "They're a different breed from Eastern youngsters, I must say." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Children are children, Mr. Richardson. They all need guidance, patience, and a firm hand when necessary." Reed's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Mrs. Whitmore, evidently eager to prevent further discussion, directed everyone to begin eating. The meal was simple but hearty beef stew, bread and boiled potatoes, with apple pie for dessert. Eleanor found it challenging to eat while holding Sarah, who had begun to fuss as the room filled with unfamiliar voices and scents. She managed a few bites between soothing her daughter, but soon Sarah's fussing turned to outright crying. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Eleanor and her distressed child. Mrs. Whitmore's expression was a mixture of vindication and annoyance. "Perhaps you should take the child upstairs, Mrs. Thompson," she suggested, her tone making it clear that it wasn't a suggestion at all. Eleanor felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Yes, of course. I'm sorry for the disruption." She was about to stand when Reed surprised everyone by setting down his spoon and holding out his arms. "May I?" he asked quietly. Startled, Eleanor hesitated, then carefully passed Sarah to him. Reed took the baby with unexpected confidence, cradling her against his broad chest with one arm while continuing to eat with his free hand. Sarah's cries subsided almost immediately, her tiny face turning toward Reed with wide, curious eyes. The table remained silent, watching in amazement as the cowboy continued eating as if holding a baby was the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth had fallen open slightly, and she closed it with an audible snap. "Mr. Winters, Mrs. Richardson finally said, you seem quite experienced with children." Reed shrugged, his attention on Sarah, who had grabbed hold of his index finger. "Had 4 younger siblings, madam. Helped raise them all after our mother passed." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude toward this quiet man who seemed to appear exactly when she needed help. "Thank you," she mouthed across the table. He nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Eat your supper, Mrs. Thompson. Little Sarah and I are getting acquainted just fine." The tension in the room gradually dissipated as conversation resumed, though Eleanor noticed several curious glances directed at Reed and the baby. Mrs. Whitmore remained stiff and disapproving, but said nothing further about the situation. By the time the meal ended, Sarah had fallen asleep against Reed's chest, her small fist still wrapped around his finger. With great care, he passed her back to Eleanor. "She's a good baby," he said softly. "Strong grip, too. She'll do well in this world." Eleanor cradled her sleeping daughter, touched by his words. "I hope so, Mr. Winters. I truly hope so." As the boarders dispersed for the evening, Reed lingered in the hallway. "I'll walk you to the mayor's office tomorrow morning if you'd like. He's usually there by 8. "That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose further." Reed shook his head. "No imposition, madam. I'm headed that way anyhow." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Hayes City can be a hard place for newcomers, especially women alone. Folks need time to take your measure. Having someone to make proper introductions might help." Eleanor recognized the wisdom in his words. As much as she valued her independence, she was a stranger in this town, and first impressions would matter. "Thank you, then. I accept your offer." Reed nodded, satisfaction visible in his eyes. 8 o'clock. I'll meet you downstairs." As Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself wondering about Reed Winters. He didn't fit neatly into her understanding of Western men, based largely on dime novels and her cousin's letters. There was a gentleness to him that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance and the quiet authority he commanded. And the way he had handled Sarah with such natural ease and care spoke of a man who understood the value of tenderness. In her room, Eleanor carefully changed Sarah into her nightdress and settled her in the small travel crib she had brought from St. Louis. The baby stirred but didn't wake, exhausted from the day's journey and excitement. Eleanor changed into her own nightgown and knelt beside her bed, her hands clasped in prayer. She prayed for Thomas's soul, as she did every night. She prayed for Sarah's health and happiness. And tonight, she added a new prayer, one of gratitude for the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had cleared the path for her first steps in this new life. Morning arrived with a pale sun struggling to break through heavy clouds. Eleanor woke to Sarah's hungry cries, her body stiff from the unfamiliar bed. The room was cold, the fire in the stove downstairs not yet strong enough to warm the upper floor. She quickly dressed Sarah and herself, choosing her second-best dress for her meeting with the mayor, a navy blue wool that, while still within the bounds of appropriate morning attire, wasn't as severe as the black she had worn the previous day. Breakfast at the boarding house was a simple affair of porridge, toast, and coffee. Only Mr. Hoffman and the 2 clerks were present, along with Mrs. Whitmore, who served the meal in silence. There was no sign of Reed, and Eleanor wondered if he had forgotten his offer to accompany her to the mayor's office. Her question was answered when she returned to her room to collect her teaching credentials and references. A soft knock at her door revealed Reed, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice low as if mindful of waking Sarah, who was contentedly playing with a small wooden rattle on the bed. "Ready to see the mayor?" "Yes, thank you." Eleanor gathered her papers and picked up Sarah, wrapping her in a warm blanket against the October chill. They walked in companionable silence down Hayes City's Main Street. The town was coming to life around them, shopkeepers opening their doors, a wagon loaded with lumber rattling past, women with market baskets heading toward the general store. Several people nodded to Reed, their curious gazes lingering on Eleanor and the baby. "Mr. Winters," Eleanor said after a moment, "may I ask what you do here in Hayes City? You mentioned you were headed to the mayor's office yourself." Reed adjusted his hat against the wind. "I work for the mayor sometimes, doing odd jobs, but mostly I manage the livery stable at the edge of town. Train horses, repair wagons, that sort of thing." "You're good with horses." A small smile crossed his face. "Better with horses than people most days." Eleanor found that hard to believe, given the natural way he had handled the situation at the boarding house, but she didn't contradict him. "And you've been in Hayes City long, going on 3 years now. Came west after the war, worked cattle drives for a while, then decided I wanted something more permanent." He glanced at her. "What about you, Mrs. Thompson? Teaching was your profession before marriage." Eleanor nodded. "I taught at a small school outside St. Louis. Nothing grand, but I loved it. When Thomas and I married, we agreed I would teach our own children when they came along." Her voice softened. "We had such plans." Reed's expression was sympathetic but not pitying, which Eleanor appreciated. "Plans have a way of changing out here. The West doesn't much care what we intend, it has its own ideas." They arrived at the mayor's office, a modest brick building that also housed the town's administrative offices. Reed opened the door for Eleanor, and they entered a small anteroom where a young man sat at a desk, sorting through papers. "Morning, Sam," Reed said. "Mrs. Thompson here to see the mayor about the teaching position." The young man looked up, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Eleanor with Sarah. "Oh, yes, of course. Mayor Collins mentioned you might be coming by." He stood and knocked on an inner door, then opened it after hearing a muffled response from within. "Mayor, Mr. Winters and Mrs. Thompson are here to see you." Mayor Collins was a portly man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and a bushy mustache. He rose from behind his desk as they entered, extending a hand first to Reed, then to Eleanor. "Mrs. Thompson, welcome to Hayes City. Reed mentioned you were interested in our teaching position." Eleanor shook his hand, grateful for Reed's apparent preparation. "Yes, sir. I taught for 2 years in St. Louis before my marriage, and I have my credentials here." She handed him the papers she had carried. The mayor gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit down. Reed, you're staying." Reed had moved to stand by the window, his stance casual but attentive. "If you don't mind, Mayor, I told Mrs. Whitmore I'd make sure Mrs. Thompson got settled properly." Mayor Collins nodded, then turned his attention to Eleanor's credentials while she briefly explained her situation: her husband's death, the loss of their farm, and her journey to Hayes City in hopes of starting anew. "Well, Mrs. Thompson, your credentials are excellent and we are in desperate need of a teacher. The children have been without proper schooling for over a month now." The mayor leaned back in his chair. "However, I must be frank. Some parents might have concerns about a teacher with a young child of her own. They might worry about your attention being divided." Eleanor had anticipated this objection. "I understand those concerns, Mayor Collins, but I can assure you that I am fully capable of managing both responsibilities. Sarah is a good baby, and during school hours I would arrange for proper care for her." The mayor nodded thoughtfully. "And what about your situation? As a widow, I mean. Hayes City is not St. Louis. We have our share of rough elements, and a woman alone." "Mayor," Reed interrupted quietly, "Mrs. Thompson has already demonstrated considerable courage and resourcefulness in getting here. I reckon she can handle Hayes City." The mayor glanced at Reed, something unspoken passing between the men. "Yes, well, you're right, of course." He turned back to Eleanor. "The position pays $30 a month during the school term, which runs from September to May. You'd be responsible for all children from 6 to 16 years of age, though most of the older boys only attend during the winter months when farm work is lighter. That seems fair, Eleanor said, mentally calculating how she would budget such a sum. The schoolhouse is at the edge of town, nothing fancy, but solid enough. There's a small room attached that served as living quarters for Miss Abernathy. It would be yours as part of your compensation. Eleanor felt a surge of relief at the mention of living quarters. The boarding house rates would have quickly depleted her savings. When could I begin? She asked. As soon as you're settled. Tomorrow, if you're willing. The school board will want to meet you formally, but that can happen after you've started. The important thing is getting the children back to their studies. Tomorrow would be fine, Eleanor said, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness at how quickly things were moving. The mayor stood, signaling the end of their meeting. Excellent. Reed, would you show Mrs. Thompson the schoolhouse today? Make sure everything's in order. Reed nodded. I was planning to, sir. As they left the mayor's office, Eleanor found herself walking slightly taller, buoyed by this first success. She had a position, a purpose, and a place to live, all within 24 hours of arriving in Hayes City. Perhaps this new beginning would work out after all. The mayor seemed very accommodating, she said to Reed as they walked back into the crisp morning air. Reed adjusted his hat again, squinting against the strengthening sunlight. Collins is a good man, fair-minded, and he's desperate to get the school reopened. Parents have been complaining for weeks. Why did the previous teacher leave? A shadow passed over Reed's face. Miss Abernathy was getting on in years. The winters out here are hard, and last year's took a toll on her health. She moved east to live with her sister. They walked toward the edge of town, past the various businesses and residences that made up Hayes City. Eleanor noticed that the buildings became more scattered the further they went from the center, until finally they reached a small, white clapboard structure standing alone on a slight rise. A simple bell tower crowned the roof, and a few rough-hewn benches dotted the yard around it. The schoolhouse, Reed said, unnecessarily. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, which creaked as it opened. The interior was a single large room, simply furnished with rows of desks facing a teacher's desk and blackboard. A cast-iron stove stood in the center, and windows lined both sides, allowing light to fill the space despite the gathering clouds outside. A door at the back presumably led to the living quarters the mayor had mentioned. It's perfect, Eleanor said softly, already imagining the room filled with children. Reed opened the back door, revealing a small but tidy space with a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and a cabinet. Another door led to what appeared to be a tiny pantry. Miss Abernathy left most of her furniture, Reed explained. The stove works well. I checked it myself before she left. It gets cold out here, being separate from other buildings. Eleanor nodded, mentally placing her few possessions in the space. It would be tight with Sarah's crib, but manageable. And the privacy, after years of farm life and then the crowded journey west, seemed like a luxury. There's a well just behind for water, Reed continued, and an outhouse about 20 yards back. I fixed the door last month so it closes properly now. You seem to take care of many things around Hayes City, Mr. Winters. Reed shrugged, a hint of color touching his cheeks. I'm good with my hands, and folks know I'll do a job right. Sarah began to fuss, and Eleanor bounced her gently. Do you think the town will accept me, truly? A widow with a child from the east. Reed was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. People here judge by actions more than circumstances, Mrs. Thompson. Show them you can teach their children well, that you're not afraid of hard work, and they'll accept you quick enough. He paused. And having the mayor's approval helps. Collins is well respected. Eleanor appreciated his honesty. Thank you for everything you've done, Mr. Winters. I don't know how I would have managed without your help. Just being neighborly, madam. But there was something in his expression, a warmth that belied the casual words. They spent the next hour examining the schoolhouse and living quarters more thoroughly. Reed showed Eleanor how to operate the stoves, pointed out a small shed where firewood was stored, and promised to bring more before the next day. He also identified a few minor repairs needed: a loose floorboard, a window that didn't quite close properly, and said he would tend to them that afternoon. As they walked back toward town, Eleanor found herself thinking that Reed Winters was unlike any man she had met before. There was a quiet competence about him, an unassuming strength that didn't need to announce itself. He reminded her a bit of Thomas in that way, though her late husband had been more bookish, less physically imposing. "Mr. Winters," she said as they approached the boarding house, "I was wondering if you might recommend someone who could watch Sarah during school hours." "Just until I get properly settled." Reed considered this for a moment. "Mrs. Ellis might be willing. She runs the bakery with her husband, but she's always saying how she misses having little ones around since her own grew up. I could introduce you this afternoon if you'd like." "That would be wonderful, thank you." As they reached the boarding house, Reed paused. "I'll come by around 2 to take you to meet Mrs. Ellis, then we can move your things to the schoolhouse, if that suits you." "Yes, that would be perfect." Reed touched his hat in farewell and turned toward the livery stable, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street. Eleanor watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly. Relief at having found an ally in this unfamiliar place. But there was something else too, a fluttering awareness that made her cheeks warm despite the cool air. She pushed the feeling aside as she entered the boarding house. There were too many practical matters to attend to preparing for her first day of teaching, arranging childcare for Sarah, moving to the schoolhouse to dwell on such thoughts. Reed Winters was being kind to a newcomer in need, nothing more. And she was a widow of just 3 months, still raw with grief for Thomas. Whatever this flutter was, it had no place in her life right now. Yet as she climbed the stairs to pack her belongings, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to see those clear blue eyes light up with a genuine smile one meant just for her. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity and adjustment for Eleanor. The school reopened with 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, each with their own abilities, personalities, and challenges. Mrs. Ellis, a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s, had indeed agreed to watch Sarah during school hours, refusing payment beyond Eleanor's help with mending clothes in the evenings. "Having a baby in the house again is payment enough," Mrs. Ellis had insisted, her kind face glowing as she cradled Sarah. "Besides, I can bake while she naps, and having someone to talk to makes the work go faster." The townspeople had gradually warmed to Eleanor, moving from polite distance to cautious acceptance as they saw her dedication to their children's education. She made a point of attending church each Sunday, participating in community events when invited, and treating everyone with equal respect regardless of their station. Reed Winters remained a constant, if somewhat enigmatic, presence in her life. He stopped by the schoolhouse regularly, always with some practical reason: delivering firewood, fixing a broken hinge, checking that the stove was working properly as the weather grew colder. He rarely stayed long and always maintained a respectful distance, but Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. It was late November, with the first real snow of the season falling softly outside, when Eleanor heard the now familiar knock on her door after school hours. She opened it to find Reed standing there, snowflakes melting in his hair and on the shoulders of his heavy coat. "Evening, Mrs. Thompson," he said, stamping his boots to shake off the snow. "Brought you some extra firewood. Storms coming in from the north might be a bad one. Please come in." Eleanor stepped back, allowing him into the small living quarters. Sarah sat on a blanket on the floor, playing with wooden blocks that Mr. Ellis had carved for her. At 7 months old, she could now sit up unassisted and was becoming more animated and interactive every day. Reed nodded a greeting to Sarah, who responded with a happy gurgle, reaching toward him with chubby hands. A smile touched his lips, a genuine one that reached his eyes and transformed his usually serious face. "She's growing fast," he observed, setting down the armful of wood next to the stove. "Too fast," Eleanor agreed. "She's trying to crawl now, though she mostly just rocks back and forth." Reed crouched down to Sarah's level, and the baby immediately reached for the buttons on his coat, fascinated by their shine. He allowed her to grab his finger instead, his large hand dwarfing her tiny one. "Strong grip," he murmured, an echo of his comment from that first night at the boarding house. "She'll be running before you know it." Eleanor watched the interaction with a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the crackling fire in the stove. It still surprised her how natural Reed was with Sarah, how gentle those work-roughened hands could be. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Winters?" "It's the least I can offer for all your help." Reed looked up, seeming almost startled by the invitation. "That's kind of you, madam, but I don't want to impose." "It's no imposition. The company would be welcome, actually." Eleanor moved to the small stove where a pot of coffee was keeping warm. "The evenings can be quiet out here, especially now that the weather's turned." After a moment's hesitation, Reed nodded. "Thank you, then. Coffee would be nice." Eleanor poured 2 cups and they sat at her small table. For a few minutes they sipped in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the wind outside, the crackling of the fire, and Sarah's occasional happy babbling as she played. "How are you finding teaching?" Reed finally asked. "The children behaving themselves?" Eleanor smiled. "They're good children, mostly. A few troublemakers. Of course, Billy Peterson seems determined to test me at every turn, and the Cooper twins are full of mischief. But they're all eager to learn, which makes the work worthwhile. And the parents, no more concerns about your situation. If there are, they haven't voiced them to me. Mrs. Peterson actually thanked me yesterday for helping Billy with his reading. Apparently, he's been practicing at home, which he never did before." Reed nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. Told you they'd come around once they saw what you can do." Eleanor took another sip of coffee, gathering her courage for the question she had been wanting to ask for weeks. "Mr. Winters, Reed, may I ask you something personal?" His eyebrows rose slightly at her use of his first name, but he nodded. "Of course. Why did you help me that day at the boarding house? You didn't know me, had no reason to intervene with Mrs. Whitmore." Reed was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, touched with an emotion Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "My mother was widowed young with 5 children to raise. I was the oldest, but still just a boy 12 when my father died. We lived in Tennessee then." He paused, his gaze distant. "There were people who helped us, neighbors who stepped in when they didn't have to. And there were others who turned away, who thought a widow with children was someone else's problem." He looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes directly. "When I saw you standing there with Sarah, about to be turned away, I couldn't walk past, couldn't be like those who looked the other way when my mother needed help." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty of his explanation. "Your mother raised a good man, Reed Winters." A flush crept up his neck and he looked down at his coffee. She did her best with what she had. Is she still living? Reed shook his head. Passed on 5 years ago. My siblings are scattered now, one brother in California, 2 sisters in Oregon with their husbands, youngest brother in the army somewhere out east. And you came to Kansas. After the war, yes, seemed like a place where a man could start fresh, build something of his own. He glanced around the small room, then at Sarah, who had fallen asleep on her blanket. You're doing a brave thing, Mrs. Thompson. Starting over in a new place, raising your daughter alone, taking on the whole town's children to educate. Eleanor felt a rush of emotions at his words: pride, gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart beat a little faster. Eleanor, she said softly. If I may call you Reed, then please call me Eleanor. His eyes met hers again, and this time there was a warmth in them that hadn't been there before. Eleanor, he repeated, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. He smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face and made him look younger, less weathered by life's hardships. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Sarah stirred in her sleep, breaking the spell. Reed cleared his throat and stood, placing his empty cup on the table. I should go. Got horses to tend to before this storm gets worse. He moved to the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. If you need anything more wood, help with the stove, anything at all, just send word to the livery. I'm never far. Thank you, Reed, for everything. After he left, Eleanor sat for a long time at the table, her coffee growing cold, her thoughts tumbling over each other like leaves in a prairie wind. She had not expected this, had not come to Kansas looking for anything beyond a fresh start and a way to support her daughter. Thomas had been gone only 4 months, and part of her felt guilty for the warmth that spread through her chest when Reed smiled, for the way her pulse quickened when their eyes met. Yet another part of her, a part that had been dormant since Thomas fell ill, was awakening, reminding her that she was still young, still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond grief and determination. It frightened her, this reawakening. But as she lifted the sleeping Sarah and placed her gently in her crib, Eleanor admitted to herself that it also felt like hope, like the first green shoots pushing through the snow, promising that spring would eventually return. The predicted storm arrived with full force the next day, bringing howling winds and snow that accumulated rapidly. School was canceled as parents kept their children home, unwilling to risk the journey through the deepening drifts. Eleanor spent the day with Sarah, grateful for the extra firewood Reed had brought and the sturdy construction of the schoolhouse that kept out the worst of the wind. By evening, the storm showed no signs of abating. Eleanor had just put Sarah down for the night and was preparing for bed herself when a pounding at the door startled her. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened the door cautiously, gasping at the wall of white that greeted her and the figure that emerged from it. Reed stood there, nearly unrecognizable under a layer of snow, his face red from the cold. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the wind. "You need to come with me now. The creek's rising with the melt from upriver and this place is too close. Flooding. But it's snowing, warm front coming behind the storm. Creek's already over its banks to the north. Mayor's ordered everyone to higher ground." He looked past her to where Sarah slept. "Pack what you need for the night quickly. I'll carry the baby." Eleanor didn't waste time arguing. She had seen what flash floods could do in Missouri, how quickly they could turn deadly. She grabbed a bag and filled it with essentials: diapers for Sarah, a change of clothes for them both, the small wooden box containing Thomas's photograph, and her wedding ring, which had become too loose after the weight she had lost during her grief. Reed had already wrapped Sarah in multiple blankets and was holding her securely against his chest. The baby had woken and was surprisingly calm, staring up at Reed with sleepy curiosity. "Ready?" he asked as Eleanor put on her coat and boots. She nodded, securing her bonnet against the wind. "Where are we going?" "The church. It's on the highest point in town." Reed handed Sarah back to Eleanor long enough to wrap a heavy blanket around them both, then took the baby again. "Stay close to me, hold onto my coat. The wind's strong enough to separate us if you're not careful." They stepped out into a world transformed by snow and wind. Eleanor could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but Reed moved with confidence, one arm holding Sarah securely, the other extended behind him for Eleanor to grasp. They trudged through snow that reached mid-calf, the wind driving ice particles against their faces like tiny needles. The journey that normally took 10 minutes stretched to nearly 30 as they fought against the elements. Eleanor's fingers grew numb despite her gloves, and her face burned with cold. She focused on the broad back in front of her, on the steady progress Reed made despite the conditions, on the knowledge that Sarah was protected in his strong arms. Finally, the church loomed before them, its windows glowing with lamplight. Reed pushed open the heavy door, and they stumbled into warmth and light and the murmur of many voices. The church was filled with townspeople, families huddled together on pews, children sleeping under blankets on the floor, the elderly given priority seating near the stoves that had been set up at either end of the building. Mayor Collins stood near the front, deep in conversation with the minister and several men Eleanor recognized as members of the town council. Mrs. Ellis spotted them immediately and hurried over, her round face creased with concern. "Thank the Lord you're safe. We were just about to send another search party." She reached for Sarah, who had fallen asleep again despite the commotion. "Let me take her while you warm up, dear." Eleanor relinquished her daughter gratefully, her arms aching from the tension of the journey. Reed guided her to a space near one of the stoves, removing the snow-covered blanket from her shoulders and replacing it with a dry one someone handed him. "Drink this," he said, pressing a cup of hot coffee into her hands. "You're chilled to the bone." Eleanor's teeth chattered as she sipped the strong, sweet liquid. Thank you for coming for us. I didn't realize the danger." Reed crouched beside her, his own face still red from the cold. "The schoolhouse is too isolated. If the creek rises much more, it could be cut off entirely." His expression was grave. "I should have thought of it sooner, but the flooding caught everyone by surprise. The warm front wasn't supposed to hit until tomorrow." Mayor Collins approached, nodding to Eleanor before turning to Reed. "Winters, we need more men at the South Bridge. Jameson says it's in danger of washing out and there are still families on the other side." Reed stood immediately. "I'll go." "Reed, no," Eleanor found herself saying, reaching for his arm. "It's too dangerous out there." His eyes softened as he looked down at her, and his hand briefly covered hers where it rested on his sleeve. "I'll be careful, but there are children out there who need help." Eleanor knew she couldn't argue with that. She nodded, releasing his arm. "Be safe." He held her gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, then turned and followed the mayor to where several men were preparing to venture back into the storm. The next few hours were among the longest of Eleanor's life. She sat with Mrs. Ellis, taking turns holding Sarah, listening to the howl of the wind outside and the occasional updates brought by men who came and went from the rescue efforts. The creek had indeed overflowed its banks, flooding the lower parts of town. Several homes had been damaged, and the road to the south was washed out in places. It was past midnight when Reed finally returned with the last group of rescuers, helping to carry an elderly man who had refused to leave his home until the water was literally at his doorstep. Reed's clothes were soaked, his face and hands scratched and bruised, but his eyes were alert as they scanned the church until they found Eleanor. She rose to meet him as he approached, relief washing over her at the sight of him safe and whole. "You're hurt," she said, noticing a cut above his eye that had left a trail of blood down his cheek. Reed touched it absently. "It's nothing. Branch caught me when we were helping the Taylors across their yard." He looked beyond her to where Sarah slept in Mrs. Ellis's arms. "Everyone all right here?" "Yes, we're fine. Just worried about you, all of you," she amended quickly, including the other rescuers in her glance. Reed nodded, seeming too tired for conversation. Eleanor guided him to a seat and brought him coffee and a plate of food that was being distributed. She found a clean handkerchief, and after dampening it with a little water, gently cleaned the cut on his forehead. He sat quietly under her ministrations, his eyes never leaving her face. "Thank you," he said simply when she had finished. "It's nothing compared to what you did tonight." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Seams were even then. Eleanor returned the smile, aware of a shift between them, a new understanding born of shared danger and mutual concern. She had seen Reed at his most elemental tonight, risking himself to help others, and something in her had responded to that selflessness, that quiet courage. The church gradually quieted as people settled in for what remained of the night. Blankets and makeshift pallets covered the floor, families huddled together for warmth and comfort. Eleanor found a corner where she could lay Sarah's blankets, creating a soft nest for her daughter. Reed, after checking that all rescue efforts were complete for the night, returned to where Eleanor was settling Sarah. "Mind if I stay nearby?" he asked, his voice low so as not to disturb those already sleeping. "Most spaces are taken, and I'd feel better knowing you two were safe." Eleanor nodded, aware of the propriety issues but too exhausted to care what others might think. "Of course." He settled on the floor a respectful distance away, using his still damp coat as a pillow. Eleanor lay down beside Sarah, one hand resting protectively on her daughter, her eyes meeting Reed's across the small space between them. "Good night, Reed," she whispered. "Good night, Eleanor," he replied, his voice a soft rumble in the dimness. "Sleep well." Despite her exhaustion, Eleanor remained awake for some time, watching Reed's features gradually relax as he fell into sleep. His face looked younger, less guarded in repose, the lines of worry and responsibility temporarily smoothed away. She wondered about the life that had shaped him, about the war he had mentioned only in passing, about the families scattered across the country, and about the heart that beat beneath that quiet exterior. She wondered, too, about her own heart, which seemed to be healing in ways she hadn't expected. The raw wound of Thomas's death was still there, still painful when touched, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. There was gratitude for this new life she was building, joy in watching Sarah grow, satisfaction in teaching the town's children, and now, unexpectedly, a warm flutter of possibility when she looked at the sleeping man across from her. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was that perhaps this was what moving forward looked like, not forgetting the past, but allowing it to become part of a larger story, one that continued to unfold in ways she couldn't have imagined. The floodwaters receded over the next few days, leaving behind mud, debris, and considerable damage to the lower parts of town. The schoolhouse, while spared the worst of the flooding, had suffered some water damage to the floor and one wall where the snow had drifted and melted against the foundation. Mayor Collins declared that classes would be suspended for a week to allow for repairs and cleanup throughout the town. Eleanor and Sarah remained at the church for 2 days. then moved temporarily into a spare room at the Ellises' home above their bakery. Reed came by daily, first to report on the state of the schoolhouse repairs, then increasingly to spend time with Eleanor and Sarah during the forced break from teaching. It was on one such visit, a week after the flood, that Reed arrived with an unexpected proposal. Eleanor was helping Mrs. Ellis roll out pie dough while Sarah napped in a makeshift crib nearby. "The schoolhouse will be ready by Monday," Reed announced as he accepted a cup of coffee from Mr. Ellis. "We've replaced the damaged floorboards and reinforced the west wall. Should be tighter against the wind now, too." "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said, wiping flour from her hands. "I've missed teaching, and I know the children are restless at home." Reed nodded, his expression unusually hesitant. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Eleanor, in private if possible." Mrs. Ellis immediately made herself scarce, dragging her protesting husband into the front of the bakery with a significant look that made Eleanor blush. Reed's serious demeanor, however, suggested that whatever he wanted to discuss wasn't what Mrs. Ellis was clearly hoping for. "What is it?" Eleanor asked when they were alone, Sarah's soft breathing the only sound in the room. Reed set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about your situation at the schoolhouse. It's too isolated, especially in winter. If there had been a proper flood, not just the threat of one." He shook his head. "It's not safe for you and Sarah out there alone." Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment. She had come to value her independence, the small home she had created for herself and Sarah. "What are you suggesting?" "That we move back to town, in a manner of speaking." Reed met her eyes directly. "I own a house at the edge of town, closer to the livery. It's nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, small parlor, but it's on higher ground within shouting distance of neighbors, and I've kept it in good repair." He paused, then continued in a rush. "I'm proposing that you and Sarah take the house, and I'll move into the rooms above the livery stable." Eleanor stared at him, taken aback by the unexpected offer. "Reed, I couldn't possibly, it's not charity," he interrupted, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "You'd pay rent, same as you would anywhere else, and in return I'd know you and Sarah were safe. But it's your home. I can't ask you to leave it for us." Reed shrugged, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I'm not there much anyway. Work keeps me at the stable most days and nights." He looked up again, his blue eyes earnest. "At least come see it before you decide." Eleanor hesitated, torn between practicality and pride. The schoolhouse was indeed isolated, as the flood had demonstrated, and winters in Kansas were harsher than those she had known in Missouri. Having neighbors nearby would mean added security for herself and Sarah. "All right," she finally agreed. "I'll look at it, but I'm not promising anything." Relief washed over Reed's face. "That's all I'm asking." Later that afternoon, with Sarah bundled against the December chill, they walked to Reed's house. It stood on a gentle rise at the northeastern edge of town, a modest structure of weathered wood with a small porch across the front. A barn stood to one side, and beyond it, Eleanor could see the roofs of neighboring houses close enough for comfort, but not for intrusion. The interior was simple but well-maintained, with solid furniture that showed signs of careful craftsmanship. The kitchen was larger than the one at the schoolhouse, with a proper stove and a pump that brought water directly inside, a luxury Eleanor hadn't expected. The 2 bedrooms were plain but clean. One obviously Reed's with its sparse furnishings, the other used for storage but easily convertible for Sarah. "It's a lovely home, Reed," Eleanor said honestly as they stood in the small parlor, Sarah examining a wooden horse carving that sat on a side table. "It needs a woman's touch," Reed admitted, looking around as if seeing it through her eyes. "But it's warm in winter, cool in summer, and the roof doesn't leak." Eleanor walked to the window, which offered a view of Hayes City spread out below, the church steeple rising above the other buildings, the prairie stretching beyond. It was a beautiful vista, especially now with snow covering the landscape, softening its harsh edges. "Why are you doing this, Reed?" she asked quietly, not turning around. "The truth, please." There was a long silence behind her. When Reed finally spoke, his voice was low, touched with an emotion Eleanor hadn't heard from him before. "Because I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if the flood had been worse. Because I wake up at night still seeing you standing in that storm, trusting me to get you and Sarah to safety." He paused, and Eleanor heard him take a deep breath. "And because in the 4 months you've been in Hayes City, you've become important to me, more important than I expected, than I planned for." Eleanor turned then, finding him standing with his hat in his hands, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Reed, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon after your husband. I know you came here to be independent, not to." He gestured vaguely. "I just want you and Sarah safe. That's all." But his eyes told a different story, one of longing, of possibility, of feelings that went beyond concern for a widow and her child. And Eleanor was surprised to find that her own heart responded to that unspoken story, even as her mind cautioned restraint. "Let me think about it," she said softly. "It's a generous offer and a practical one, but it's also a big decision." Reed nodded, replacing his hat. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless." They walked back to the Elises in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah, tired from the excursion, fell asleep in Eleanor's arms, her warm weight a reminder of the responsibility that shaped every decision Eleanor made. That evening, after Sarah was asleep in their temporary quarters, Eleanor sat by the window, watching the snow fall gently outside. Her thoughts turned to Thomas, his gentle smile, his dreams for their future, the way he had looked at Sarah in the few short months he had with his daughter. She took out his photograph, tracing the lines of his face with her fingertip. "What would you want for us, Thomas?" she whispered. "Would you understand that my heart has room for memories of you and feelings for someone new? Would you want me to remain alone out of loyalty to what we had, or would you want me to find happiness again?" There was no answer, of course, but as she sat in the quiet room, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. Thomas had been a kind man, practical and loving. He would have wanted her to be safe, to provide the best life possible for their daughter. And he would have understood that love wasn't a limited resource, that caring for Reed didn't diminish what she had felt for her husband. The next morning, Eleanor asked Reed to walk with her after church. They strolled through the snow-covered streets, Sarah securely wrapped against Eleanor's chest, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I've been thinking about your offer," Eleanor began when they reached the small town square, now deserted in the winter chill. Reed nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "And I think it makes sense for Sarah and me to move into your house." She held up a hand when he started to speak. "But I have conditions." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'd expect nothing less. First, I pay fair rent, no arguments." When he nodded, she continued. "Second, you don't sleep above the stables. That's no place for a man to live, especially in winter. The storage bedroom in the house is yours whenever you need it." Reed's eyebrows rose. "Eleanor, that wouldn't be proper. It's entirely proper when the bedrooms are on opposite sides of the house and there's a child present," she countered. "Besides, I trust you, Reed Winters. I wouldn't be considering this otherwise." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. What else?" Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage for the most difficult part. "Third, we need to be honest with each other. Care for you, Reed. More than I expected to, given how recently I lost Thomas. It frightens me sometimes how quickly these feelings have developed. Reed's expression softened, hope lighting his eyes. Eleanor, let me finish, please. She adjusted Sarah, who had stirred at the sound of their voices. I'm not ready for anything more than friendship right now. I need time to be sure of my heart to honor what Thomas and I had. But I don't want to give you false hope or keep you waiting for something that might never happen. I understand, Reed said quietly, and I respect that. I would never rush you, Eleanor, never presume anything. I know. She smiled at him, relieved by his understanding. That's why I trust you, why I'm willing to consider this arrangement. But I need to know, is friendship enough for now? Can you be patient while I sort through these feelings? Reed reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her gloved hand in his. Eleanor Thompson, I've waited 34 years to meet a woman like you. I reckon I can wait a while longer to see where this path leads us. His blue eyes crinkled with warmth. Friendship is a good place to start, a solid foundation for whatever comes after. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders at his words. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Winters. Indeed we do, Mrs. Thompson. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. When would you like to move in? After Christmas, I think. That gives us time to prepare the house properly, and I'd like to give the Elises their space back for the holiday. Reed nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll get the second bedroom ready for Sarah, make sure everything's in order. They turned back toward the Elises' bakery, walking side by side through the quiet Sunday streets. Eleanor felt a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation at the decision she had made. It wasn't what she had planned when she came to Hayes City, but then nothing about her life had gone according to plan since Thomas fell ill. Perhaps, she thought as she glanced at Reed's profile beside her, the unexpected turns were part of the journey, necessary detours that led to destinations she couldn't have imagined but might come to cherish. Christmas in Hayes City was a community affair, with the church at its center. The building was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, candles glowing in every window. The children's choir, which Eleanor had helped organize, sang carols while proud parents watched. A massive tree stood at the front of the church, decorated with paper ornaments made by the schoolchildren and small gifts to be distributed after the service. Eleanor sat in a pew near the front, Sarah on her lap, dressed in a new red dress that Mrs. Ellis had sewn for the occasion. Reed sat beside them, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his Sunday best, a dark coat, clean shirt, and string tie that Eleanor suspected he wore only for church and special occasions. As the minister spoke of hope and new beginnings, Eleanor found her thoughts drifting to the year that was ending. It had brought the greatest loss she had ever known, but also unexpected blessings: a new home, a community that had accepted her, and the man sitting beside her, whose solid presence had become a comfort she hadn't known she needed. After the service, the congregation gathered in the church hall for a feast prepared by the women of the town. Eleanor had contributed pies, using Mrs. Ellis's oven, and felt a surge of pride when they were received with enthusiasm. Sarah was passed from arms to arms, the townspeople having embraced her as a communal joy, especially the older women whose own children were grown. Reed remained at Eleanor's side throughout the celebration, a quiet, steadying presence. When Mayor Collins raised a glass in a toast to the community's resilience after the flood, Reed's hand found Eleanor's beneath the table, squeezing gently in a gesture that needed no words. Later, as they walked back to the Elises through streets hushed with fresh snow, Reed carried a sleepy Sarah, who had worn herself out with the excitement of the day. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the bakery door. I have something for you, Reed said as he carefully transferred Sarah to Eleanor's arms. For both of you, actually. For Christmas. Reed, you didn't need to, I wanted to. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. It's not much, but... Eleanor adjusted Sarah in one arm and took the package with her free hand. Thank you, I have something for you as well, but it's upstairs. Reed smiled. Another time, then. Open this now. Eleanor carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. When she opened it, a soft melody began to play, a lullaby she recognized from her own childhood. Reed, it's beautiful, she breathed, touching the polished wood reverently. Made the box myself, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. Had the musical works ordered from back east. Thought Sarah might like the music and you might need a place for special things. Eleanor understood his meaning immediately, a place for Thomas's photograph, for the mementos of her previous life that she still cherished. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she said softly. It's perfect. Reed's smile deepened, reaching his eyes and creating crinkles at the corners that Eleanor had come to find endearing. Merry Christmas, Eleanor. Merry Christmas, Reed. He touched his hat in farewell, promising to return the next day to begin preparing the house for their move. As Eleanor carried Sarah upstairs, the music box tucked safely in her pocket, she felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place in a pattern she was only beginning to discern. The move to Reed's house took place 2 days after Christmas, with help from Mr. Ellis and several of the older schoolboys who were eager to earn a few coins. The weather cooperated, providing a clear, cold day that made the task straightforward if chilly. By nightfall, Eleanor and Sarah were settled in their new home, their few belongings arranged to create a sense of familiarity in the unfamiliar space. True to his word, Reed had prepared the second bedroom for Sarah, adding a rocking chair that he had made himself and shelves for the baby's things. He had also stocked the kitchen with basic provisions, filled the wood box to overflowing, and made sure every window and door was weathertight. That first evening, after Sarah was asleep in her new room, Eleanor and Reed sat in the small parlor, a fire crackling in the fireplace. The house felt different with them, in it warmer somehow, despite the winter chill that pressed against the windows. It's strange, Eleanor said, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, how quickly a place can begin to feel like home. Reed looked around the room, which already showed signs of Eleanor's presence, a quilt draped over the back of the sofa, a vase of dried prairie flowers on the mantel, books stacked neatly on a side table. It never felt quite right before, he admitted. Just a place to sleep between work days. Now it feels. He searched for the right word. Alive, Eleanor suggested. He nodded. Yes, alive. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the fire pop and crackle, the wind singing around the eaves outside. Eleanor realized that this was what she had missed most after Thomas died, not just his presence, but the simple comfort of shared silence, of not being alone with her thoughts. Tell me about your husband, Reed said suddenly, his voice gentle in the quiet room. When Eleanor looked surprised, he added, if you want to. I'd like to know about the man who was Sarah's father. Eleanor was touched by the request, by Reed's acknowledgement of Thomas's importance in her life rather than pretending he hadn't existed. She set down her tea and drew the music box from her pocket, opening it to remove Thomas's photograph, which she handed to Reed. His name was Thomas Thompson. We met when I was teaching at the school near his family's farm. He used to bring his younger siblings to school and stay to help with repairs. The roof leaked something terrible. She smiled at the memory. He was quiet, thoughtful, loved books. We courted for a year before marrying. Reed studied the photograph, his expression respectful. He has kind eyes. He did. Eleanor felt the familiar ache of loss, but it was softer now, mellowed by time and distance. He was a good man, a good husband. He was so happy when he learned we were expecting Sarah, made plans for her future before she was even born. He would be proud of how you've carried on, Reed said, returning the photograph. Bringing her all this way, making a new life. Eleanor carefully placed the photograph back in the music box. I think he would. He never wanted me to stop teaching, even after we married. Said I had a gift for it that shouldn't be wasted. She closed the box, the melody playing briefly before falling silent. What about you, Reed? You've never spoken much about your past. Reed shifted in his chair, his gaze turning to the fire. Not much to tell. Grew up in Tennessee, fought for the Union during the war, came west afterward like a lot of men looking for something different. The war must have been difficult, Eleanor said softly, knowing that many men preferred not to speak of those dark years. Reed was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, touched with old pain. Lost my younger brother at Shiloh. He was just 17, lied about his age to enlist. I was with a different regiment, couldn't protect him. He rubbed his hand absently over a spot on his left side. Took a bullet myself at Chattanooga, but I was one of the lucky ones. Healed clean, no lasting damage. Eleanor felt a rush of sympathy for the young man he had been, facing death and loss at an age when life should have been just beginning. I'm sorry about your brother, Reed nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. War changes a man, makes him see things differently, value things he might have taken for granted before. He looked up, meeting her eyes across the space between them. That's why I came west. Wanted to build something, not destroy, make something lasting with these hands. And have you? Eleanor asked. Found what you were looking for. A slow smile spread across Reed's face, warming his eyes, getting closer every day. The winter passed in a rhythm of work, domestic tasks, and gradually deepening friendship. Eleanor taught during the day while Sarah stayed with Mrs. Ellis, then returned home to prepare supper, often with Reed joining them after finishing at the livery. The arrangement worked smoothly. Reed maintained his privacy, and Eleanor hers, but they shared meals, conversation, and the quiet evenings by the fire that became the highlight of Eleanor's days. Sarah thrived in the stable environment, growing and changing with each passing week. She began crawling in January, pulling herself across the parlor floor with determined concentration, often heading straight for Reed whenever he entered the room. By February, she was pulling herself up on furniture, wobbling precariously but fiercely independent. Reed took to fatherhood with natural ease, though he never presumed to replace Thomas in Sarah's life. He built her toys, carved animals, a small wagon she could push as she learned to walk, a rocking horse sized for a toddler that he promised she would grow into. He read to her in the evenings, his deep voice gentle as he showed her pictures in the few children's books Eleanor had brought from Missouri. The townspeople, after initial whispers about the unusual living arrangement, accepted it as practical rather than scandalous. Reed's reputation for integrity was well established in Hays City, and Eleanor had earned respect through her dedication to teaching. Mrs. Whitmore still sniffed disapprovingly when their names were mentioned together, but even she couldn't find specific fault with their behavior. It was in late March, as the first signs of spring began to soften the harsh Kansas landscape, that the boundaries of friendship between Eleanor and Reed began to shift toward something more. The evening was unusually mild, and they sat on the small porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah had fallen asleep early, worn out from an afternoon of practicing her new walking skills with Reed's patient assistance. "She's going to be running before we know it," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory of Sarah's determined little face as she took her first unassisted steps that day, falling into Reed's waiting arms with a squeal of triumph. Reed nodded, his expression soft with affection. Strong and determined, like her mother. Eleanor glanced at him, warmed by the compliment and the look in his eyes when he spoke it. Over the months, she had come to know his expressions, to read the emotions he often kept contained behind his quiet exterior. What she saw now made her heart beat faster, a tenderness and longing he no longer tried to hide. "Reed," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say, but feeling that something needed to be acknowledged between them. "I know," he said simply. "It's all right, Eleanor, we have time." But there was a question in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a hopefulness that asked if the waiting might soon be over. Eleanor felt the last of her resistance melting away, like the snow that retreated a little more each day under the strengthening sun. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what Thomas would want for Sarah and me, for our future." Reed turned to face her more fully, giving her his complete attention. "And what have you concluded?" Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "That he would want us to be happy, to be loved. That holding on to grief doesn't honor his memory, living fully does." She met Reed's gaze steadily. "I'll always love Thomas. He was my first love, Sarah's father. Nothing changes that." "I would never want to change that," Reed said softly. "I know." Eleanor smiled, feeling a sense of rightness in what she was about to say. "But my heart has room for more than memories, Reed. It has room for you, if you still want a place there." The hope in Reed's eyes blossomed into joy, transforming his usually reserved expression. "Eleanor Thompson, I've wanted a place in your heart since the day you stood on Ida Whitmore's doorstep with Sarah in your arms, refusing to be turned away." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "I love you, both of you, have for months now." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his simple declaration. "I love you too, Reed. It snuck up on me, this feeling like spring after a long winter. I wasn't looking for it, wasn't ready for it, but here it is all the same." Reed's hand tightened around hers, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "May I kiss you, Eleanor? Been wanting to for longer than I care to admit." Instead of answering, Eleanor leaned toward him, closing the distance between them. Reed met her halfway, his lips touching hers with a gentleness that made her heart ache. The kiss was brief, sweet, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Reed's eyes were bright with emotion, his hand still holding hers as if he couldn't bear to let go. "I should check on Sarah," Eleanor said softly, though she was reluctant to break the moment. Reed nodded, releasing her hand. "I'll be here." The simple statement carried weight beyond the immediate moment, a promise of constancy, of presence, of a future together. Eleanor touched his cheek briefly before rising and going inside, her heart lighter than it had been in many months. Sarah slept peacefully, her dark hair tousled against the pillow, one small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit Reed had given her for Christmas. Eleanor straightened her blanket and stood watching her daughter's peaceful breathing for a moment, filled with gratitude for this new chance at happiness that had come to them in Hayes City. When she returned to the porch, Reed had moved his chair closer to hers. She sat down beside him, and without hesitation, he put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, each lost in thoughts of the future that now seemed to stretch before them, full of promise. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked eventually, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Reed's arm tightened slightly around her. "Whatever you want, Eleanor. I'm not in any hurry. We can take this as slow as you need. Eleanor turned to look at him. Studying his face in the fading light, the strong lines softened now with tenderness, the blue eyes that had become her anchor in this new life. I think we've been taking it slow for months now, Reed. Living together but apart, getting to know each other day by day. She smiled. Some might say we've done things backward, shared a home before sharing our hearts. Reed chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. Nothing about us has been conventional from the start. Why change now? Eleanor laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Why indeed? They sat together as darkness fell completely, the vastness of the Kansas sky opening above them, scattered with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The spring air carried a hint of moisture, a promise of renewal and growth that matched the feeling in Eleanor's heart. I should go in, Reed said eventually, though he made no move to release her. Early start tomorrow. Eleanor nodded, reluctant to end the evening but knowing there would be many more to come. Yes, it's getting late. Neither moved for several minutes, savoring the closeness, the newness of acknowledged feelings. Finally, Reed pressed a kiss to her temple and stood, helping Eleanor to her feet. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with affection. "Good night, Reed." He touched her cheek gently, then turned and walked toward the barn where he still kept his horse and some of his tools. Eleanor watched him go, a sense of peace settling over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new negotiations of this changing relationship. But tonight, it was enough to know that love had found her again when she least expected it, in the form of a quiet cowboy who had cleared a path for her and Sarah when the world seemed determined to shut them out. As spring fully arrived in Hays City, bringing green to the prairie and warmth to the air, the relationship between Eleanor and Reed blossomed openly. They no longer felt the need to hide their growing affection, though they remained respectful of Eleanor's status as a widow and the example they set for the townspeople and Eleanor's students. Reed began courting Eleanor, properly bringing wildflowers from the prairie, taking her and Sarah for Sunday drives in a borrowed buggy, sitting with them in church each week. The townspeople watched with approval as the quiet romance unfolded, many having suspected for months that the arrangement at Reed's house was more than mere practicality. It was on a warm evening in early May, with the scent of new growth hanging in the air, that Reed finally spoke of marriage. They sat on the porch steps, watching Sarah toddle around the small yard, now steady on her feet and fiercely proud of her independence. "She's growing so fast," Reed observed, his eyes following Sarah's determined exploration of a patch of dandelions. "Seems like yesterday she was just learning to crawl." Eleanor nodded, her heart full as she watched her daughter. Sarah was nearly a year old now, her personality emerging more clearly each day, stubborn, curious, and increasingly vocal. Time passes differently when you're watching a child grow. Both too quickly and not quickly enough. Reed was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that he kept concealed in his palm. "Eleanor, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Eleanor turned to him, her pulse quickening at the seriousness in his tone. "Yes." Reed looked down at his closed hand, then back to her face. "I love you and Sarah more than I ever thought possible. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. "I want us to be a family officially, properly. Will you marry me, Eleanor?" Though she had anticipated this moment, had known in her heart that they were moving toward marriage, the actual question still brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She placed her hand over his, feeling the ring between their palms. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. Yes, I will marry you, Reed Winters. Joy transformed Reed's face as he took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the late afternoon light. I wasn't sure, he admitted, if it was too soon after Thomas. Eleanor shook her head, looking down at the ring that now symbolized her new beginning. It's been nearly a year since he died. I've mourned him and I'll always honor his memory. She met Reed's gaze. But life is for the living, Reed. Thomas would understand that better than anyone. Reed leaned forward and kissed her, a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they parted, Sarah had toddled over to them, curious about this new development. Reed lifted her easily, settling her on his lap. "What do you think, Miss Sarah?" he asked, his voice light. "Ready to make me your pa officially?" Sarah reached for the pearl on Eleanor's ring, her small face serious as she examined the new addition to her mother's hand. Then she looked up at Reed and declared with perfect clarity, "Pa." It was the first time she had called him that, though she had been saying Mama for months. Eleanor felt fresh tears spring to her eyes at the simple acceptance in her daughter's voice, the rightness of the moment. Reed's expression was one of wonder and deep emotion as he held Sarah closer. "That's right, little one. Your pa." He looked at Eleanor over the top of Sarah's dark curls, his eyes shining. "When should we have the wedding?" Eleanor considered the question. "Soon, I think. Before school ends for the summer. That would give us time for a short trip afterward if you'd like." The idea of a honeymoon journey was both exciting and slightly frightening. She hadn't traveled beyond Hayes City since her arrival last fall. Reed nodded, his face alight with plans and possibilities. "I know a beautiful spot in the foothills to the west. Cabin belonging to a friend who said I could use it any time. Stream nearby, trees for shade, mountains in the distance." His voice grew soft with anticipation. "I'd like to show it to you, to share that place with you and Sarah." "It sounds perfect," Eleanor said, imagining the three of them together in such a setting, away from the demands of daily life in Hayes City. They decided on a June wedding after the school term ended, but before the full heat of summer descended on the plains. Mayor Collins, when informed of their engagement the next day, insisted on making it a town celebration. "First wedding we've had in Hayes City in almost a year," he declared. "And considering how much you both mean to this community, it ought to be properly commemorated." Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. Mrs. Ellis immediately volunteered to bake the wedding cake, while other townswomen offered to help with decorations, flowers, and food for the reception. Even Mrs. Whitmore, unbent enough to offer the use of her best tablecloths for the occasion. The children in Eleanor's school were perhaps the most excited of all, particularly the girls who romanticized the idea of their teacher marrying the quiet cowboy, who sometimes brought them treats when he came to repair something at the schoolhouse. "Will you still be our teacher after you're married, Mrs. Thompson?" asked 10-year-old Lily Peterson during lessons one day. "Yes, though I'll be Mrs. Winters then," Eleanor replied, still adjusting to the idea of her new name. "And will Mr. Winters come live at the schoolhouse?" Billy Peterson, Lily's brother and the class troublemaker, asked with a mischievous grin. Eleanor smiled, maintaining her composure despite the children's giggles. "No, Billy. I'll be moving permanently into Mr. Winters's house, where Sarah and I have been staying. The new teacher who comes after me will live at the schoolhouse." This news sobered the children, who hadn't fully considered that their teacher's marriage might eventually lead to her departure from the school. Eleanor quickly reassured them that she wouldn't be leaving anytime soon, that she intended to continue teaching at least through the next school year. As the wedding day approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, She had been a grieving widow with an infant daughter and an uncertain future. Now she stood on the threshold of a new marriage, a new family, a life she couldn't have imagined in her darkest days of grief. The night before the wedding, after Sarah was asleep, Eleanor sat alone in the parlor, Thomas's photograph in her hands. Reed had gone to stay with the Elises, honoring the tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride before the ceremony. "I'm getting married tomorrow, Thomas," she whispered to the image of her first husband. "To a good man who loves Sarah as if she were his own, who respects your place in our lives and doesn't try to replace you in our hearts." She touched the photograph gently. "I hope you can see us somehow. I hope you understand that this isn't forgetting you, but finding a way to keep living, to give Sarah the family she deserves." A sense of peace settled over her, a feeling that Thomas would indeed understand, would approve of the man who would become father to his daughter. She placed the photograph back in the music box Reed had given her for Christmas, knowing that it would always have a place of honor in their home, a tangible connection to the past that had shaped them. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of prairie wildflowers. The ceremony was to be held in the church at 4 o'clock, followed by a reception in the town square, which had been decorated with lanterns, ribbons, and flowers gathered from miles around. Mrs. Ellis arrived early to help Eleanor prepare, bringing with her a crown of daisies and baby's breath for Eleanor's hair and a smaller one for Sarah, who would serve as her mother's only attendant. The dress Eleanor had chosen was not white that seemed inappropriate for a widow, but a soft blue that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. It was the nicest dress she had owned since before Thomas's illness, ordered specially from a dressmaker in Topeka with some of the money she had saved from teaching. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Ellis said, fastening the last button at the back of the dress. "Reed won't know what hit him." Eleanor smiled at her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Grief and hard work had thinned her face over the past year, but happiness had brought color to her cheeks and a light to her eyes that transformed her appearance. "I feel like I'm dreaming," she admitted, "like I might wake up back in Missouri with none of this having happened." Mrs. Ellis patted her shoulder. "Not a dream, child, just life taking its unexpected turns. The good Lord closes one door and opens another, if we're brave enough to walk through it." Sarah, dressed in a white frock with a blue sash that matched Eleanor's dress, toddled into the room, escaping from Mr. Ellis, who had been watching her while the women prepared. She stopped when she saw her mother, her brown eyes widening with delight. "Mama pretty," she declared, reaching up to be lifted. Eleanor gathered her daughter into her arms, careful not to crush either of their dresses. "You're pretty too, my sweet girl. Ready to help Mama marry your pa today." Sarah nodded solemnly, then squirmed to be put down again, her moment of appreciation for finery already passing in favor of more interesting pursuits. Mr. Ellis appeared in the doorway, apologizing for the escape. "She's quick as lightning, that one," he said with a chuckle. "Reed's at the church already, looking about as nervous as a man can be without actually running for the hills." Eleanor laughed, imagining Reed always so calm and capable, pacing nervously in his best clothes. "Tell him Sarah and I will be there soon, and that everything will be perfect." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. Eleanor walked down the aisle with Sarah beside her, the little girl managing to stay focused long enough to reach Reed, who stood at the front with the minister, looking more handsome than Eleanor had ever seen him in a new black coat and string tie. The expression on Reed's face when he saw Eleanor and Sarah approaching was one she would treasure forever, a mixture of awe, joy, and deep, abiding love that transformed his usually reserved features. He took a step forward as if unable to wait for them to reach him, then caught himself and stood straight, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's as she came to stand beside him. The minister's words were the traditional ones, spoken countless times in countless churches, yet they seemed fresh and personal as Eleanor and Reed repeated their vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all the days of their lives. When Reed placed a simple gold band on Eleanor's finger to join the pearl engagement ring, his hands were steady, but his voice caught slightly on the words with this ring, "I thee wed." The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief but heartfelt, mindful of the church setting and the gathered townspeople. Sarah, who had been remarkably patient throughout the ceremony, chose that moment to announce "kiss." In her clear, carrying voice, bringing laughter from the congregation and breaking any remaining tension, Reed scooped her up into his arms as the minister presented Mr. and Mrs. Reed Winters and their daughter, Sarah, to the assembled well-wishers. The three of them walked back down the aisle together, a family united not just by law and ceremony but by love that had grown naturally, day by day, through shared experiences and mutual respect. The reception was everything a small town celebration should be: abundant food prepared by loving hands, music from local musicians who played with more enthusiasm than skill, dancing on the wooden platform that had been built especially for the occasion, and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town square and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Reed pulled Eleanor aside for a moment of privacy amid the celebration. "Happy, Mrs. Winters?" he asked, his hands resting lightly on her waist. Eleanor smiled up at him, still adjusting to the new name but loving the sound of it on his lips. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again." Reed glanced across the square to where Sarah was being entertained by a group of older girls who had taken it upon themselves to look after the little flower girl during the festivities. "She seems to be enjoying herself." "She loves being the center of attention," Eleanor agreed. "Though I'm sure she'll fall asleep on the ride home." Reed's expression softened, his eyes returning to Eleanor's face. "Home," he repeated. "Has a nice sound to it, doesn't it? The three of us together." Eleanor leaned into him slightly, no longer concerned about maintaining propriety now that they were husband and wife. The best sound in the world. They rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and good wishes from what seemed like every resident of Hayes City. As the evening progressed and lanterns were lit against the gathering darkness, Eleanor found herself watching Reed with their guests, joking with the men from the livery, tipping his hat to the older ladies, swinging Sarah in a gentle dance when she demanded his attention. This was her husband, her family, her future built unexpectedly from the ashes of loss, but no less precious for its unusual beginnings. When it was finally time to leave, with Sarah half asleep in Reed's arms and the celebration still going strong behind them, they walked home through the quiet streets of Hayes City. The house that had been Reed's, then shared as friends, now welcomed them as a family. Reed carried Sarah to her room and helped Eleanor tuck her in, the two of them standing for a moment watching their daughter sleep, her small face peaceful in the lamplight. Then, with a tenderness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, Reed took her hand and led her to what was now truly their bedroom, the room that had been his alone until this night. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Eleanor's head resting on Reed's chest, his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear, she thought about the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment of contentment. "Reed," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. His hand moved gently in her hair, confirming that sleep hadn't yet claimed him. "You remember the first thing you ever said to me? At the boarding house?" She felt rather than saw his smile in the darkness. "Bring them in," he quoted softly. Best words I ever spoke, though I didn't know it at the time. Eleanor raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, his face barely visible in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. "Why did you do it? Truly? You didn't know us, had no reason to intervene." Reed was quiet for a moment, his hand moving to cup her cheek. "I saw something in your eyes when you stood there with Sarah, determination, courage, a refusal to be beaten by circumstance. It reminded me of my mother after my father died, of how hard she fought for us." His voice softened further. "And I saw something else too, something I wasn't expecting, a possibility. Like a door opening just a crack, showing a glimpse of what might be on the other side." "And what did you see through that door?" Eleanor asked, her heart full of love for this man who could surprise her with his eloquence when emotion moved him. Reed's thumb traced the curve of her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "This," he said simply. "Us. A family. A home that's truly a home, not just a place to sleep. Everything I never knew I was looking for, until you stood on that porch with Sarah in your arms." Eleanor leaned down and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the love and gratitude she felt for this unexpected gift of a second chance at happiness. When they parted, Reed drew her back down beside him, his arms encircling her with a protectiveness that made her feel both safe and cherished. "Sleep now, Eleanor," he murmured against her hair. "Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of our lives together." As Eleanor drifted toward sleep, she thought of all the tomorrows stretching before them, Sarah growing up, perhaps siblings joining her, years of teaching and learning, of seasons changing across the Kansas prairie, of love deepening through shared joys and sorrows. The future, once so uncertain, now felt full of promise, not because all challenges had been overcome, but because they would face whatever came together, as a family forged from both loss and love. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was one of profound gratitude for the kindness of a stranger who had cleared a hall and said, "Bring them in," changing the course of her life with 3 simple words and a heart big enough to embrace both a widow and her child. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening, Eleanor sat on the porch of the Winters home, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. The house had grown with their family. Reed had added 2 more bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and a proper dining room as their needs changed. The yard, once bare prairie, now boasted a vegetable garden, flower beds, and several young trees that provided welcome shade in the summer heat. Sarah, now 6 years old and the spitting image of her birth father with her dark hair and expressive brown eyes, was helping her 3-year-old brother James collect fireflies in a jar. The little boy, with Reed's blonde hair and Eleanor's gentle nature, laughed delightedly each time a glowing insect was captured, only to insist moments later that it be released, so it can find its family. "Not too far, children," Eleanor called as the pair ventured toward the edge of the yard. "Supper will be ready soon." "Yes, Mama," Sarah replied, already a responsible older sister who took her duties seriously. She grabbed James's hand and led him back toward the porch, the jar of fireflies temporarily forgotten. The screen door opened behind Eleanor, and Reed stepped out, their youngest child cradled in his arms. At 10 months old, Elizabeth Reed Winters was a perfect blend of her parents. Reed's blue eyes set in a face that was unmistakably Eleanor's. "Someone woke up hungry," Reed said, passing the baby to Eleanor. "Crying for her mama." Eleanor took her daughter, adjusting her dress to allow the baby to nurse. After 3 children, she no longer felt self-conscious about this natural act, especially in the privacy of their home with only Reed present. He sat beside her on the porch swing, his arm stretched along the back behind her shoulders, a gesture of both protection and affection that had become as familiar as breathing. "Sarah's teacher stopped by the livery today," Reed said as they watched the older children resume their firefly hunt. "Says she's the best reader in the class, that she helps the younger ones with their letters." Pride was evident in his voice. Eleanor smiled, not surprised by the news. Sarah had been reading since the age of 4, sitting on Reed's lap in the evenings while he patiently helped her sound out words in the books Eleanor brought home from school. "She wants to be a teacher, like me. Told me yesterday she's going to teach in our school when she grows up." "She'll be a good one," Reed agreed. "Has your patience and Thomas's love of books." Eleanor glanced at him, still touched after all these years by the way Reed honored Sarah's birth father, keeping his memory alive in their home and in Sarah's heart. Thomas's photograph still held a place of honor in their parlor, and Sarah knew the story of her birth father's life and his love for her, even as she thrived under Reed's loving guidance. The years had been good to them, though not without challenges. Eleanor had continued teaching until Elizabeth's birth, balancing work and family with Reed's unwavering support. The livery stable had prospered under Reed's management, eventually allowing him to buy the business outright when the previous owner retired. Hayes City had grown too, the railroad bringing new residents and opportunities, though it still maintained its small-town character and close-knit community. "Mayor Collins asked me again about running for town council," Reed said, breaking into Eleanor's reflections. "Says we need more practical minds making decisions, less politicians." Eleanor adjusted Elizabeth, who had fallen asleep at her breast, and buttoned her dress. "You should consider it. You know this town better than most, understand what the people here need." Reed shrugged, taking the sleeping baby from Eleanor and settling her against his shoulder with practiced ease. "Maybe. Got plenty to keep me busy as it is." "You'd be good at it, Pa." Sarah had abandoned the firefly hunt and climbed the porch steps, James trailing behind her. "You always know how to fix things when they're broken." Reed laughed, reaching out to tug one of Sarah's braids gently. "Town government's a bit more complicated than fixing wagons, little one." "Not really," Sarah insisted with the certainty of a 6-year-old. "It's just people needing help, and you're good at helping people." Eleanor exchanged a smile with Reed over the children's heads, both thinking of that first meeting at the boarding-house door, when Reed's instinct to help had set them on this path together. "Supper should be ready," Eleanor said, rising from the swing. "Sarah, take James inside and wash his hands, please, and your own." As the children clattered into the house, Reed stood with Elizabeth still sleeping against his shoulder. "I'll put her down," he said. "Be right back." Eleanor watched him go. This man who had become the cornerstone of her life, who had embraced her daughter as his own from the beginning, who had given her 2 more beautiful children, and a home filled with love and laughter. The grief that had once seemed insurmountable had not disappeared. She still thought of Thomas sometimes, still felt a pang on his birthday or the anniversary of his death, but it had found its proper place in her heart, a part of her story but no longer its defining chapter. Reed returned to the porch, pausing behind Eleanor to wrap his arms around her waist and pull her back against his chest. They stood together for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded from the western sky, the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. "Happy?" Reed asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Eleanor turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face, more weathered now than when they'd met, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and responsibility, but still handsome, still the face she loved to see first each morning and last each night. "Completely," she answered, stretching up to kiss him lightly. "You?" Reed's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway, his voice deep with sincerity. "More than I ever dreamed possible." From inside the house came the sound of Sarah's voice, calling them to the table where she had already helped set out the dishes. Reed took Eleanor's hand, lacing their fingers together as they had done countless times over the years. "Coming, sweetheart." Eleanor called back, giving Reed's hand a squeeze before releasing it to go inside. As they joined their children around the table in the home they had built together, Eleanor knew with certainty that this was where she belonged, not in the life she had planned with Thomas, but in the one that had found her unexpectedly, when a widow with a baby was barred from a boarding house, and a cowboy with a kind heart cleared the hall and said, "Bring them in." In those three simple words, spoken by a stranger on a cold autumn day, Eleanor had found not just shelter for a night, but a future full of love, a family built on choice rather than just circumstance, and a happiness deeper and more enduring than she had ever dared to hope for after her world had shattered. It wasn't the life she had expected, but as Reed said grace over their meal, his deep voice steady and grateful, his hand warm around hers, Eleanor knew it was the life she was meant to have, a tapestry woven of both sorrow and joy, loss and discovery, endings and beginnings, creating a pattern more beautiful for its imperfections, more precious for having been found when all seemed lost.